really be ready to cut a nigga off over the smallest shit. Like, the littlest thing, I just be turned off. Like, ugh, like, ugh.
Something about this case has completely taken over the internet, and the deeper you go into it, the more questions start to stack up with no clear answers. Because what started as a luxury travel story has now turned into a storm of online claims, speculation, leaked theories, and conflicting timelines that nobody seems able to fully confirm. One moment, people are talking about a relationship that looked perfect on social media, and the next moment, the entire narrative shifts into something darker, more complicated, and heavily debated across platforms. Different versions of events are circulating everywhere. Some say it was a tragic incident with unanswered gaps in the timeline. Others believe there are missing details that have not been publicly explained. And then there are online commentators breaking down every piece of information like a puzzle that refuses to fit together. But here's the real reason this story refuses to die online. It's not just the incident itself, it's the contradictions surrounding it. From hotel timelines that don't fully align, to unanswered questions about who was where and when, to reactions from people connected to the situation that only add more confusion instead of clarity. And as more clips, posts, and breakdowns keep surfacing, the internet is doing what it always does, building its own version of the truth in real time. But the biggest question still remains unanswered. What really happened behind those closed doors, and why does every new detail seem to make the story even harder to believe? Because the biggest question still remains unanswered. What really happened behind those closed doors, and why does every new detail seem to make the story even harder to believe? And that's exactly where the internet started breaking this case apart piece by piece. At first, people tried to understand it through a simple lens, a tragic incident, a relationship under pressure, a sudden turn of events that ended in shock. But that explanation didn't last long once users started digging into timelines, location details, and the sequence of reported events. Because the more people looked, the more inconsistencies they believed they were seeing. One version of the timeline says everything escalated inside a private villa during a trip. Another version suggests movements in and out of rooms that don't fully line up with each other, depending on which source you read. And then there are gaps, short periods of time that remain unclear, unaccounted for, or differently described depending on who is telling the story. And in internet culture, gaps are never just gaps. They become theories. They become narratives. They become content. Soon, creators across platforms began reconstructing the situation using fragments, hotel reports, alleged witness accounts, and social media posts from people claiming to be nearby or connected. Each new video added another layer, but not necessarily more clarity. Instead, what formed was something much more chaotic, multiple competing versions of the same story, and none of them fully matching. Now, one of the most debated points online revolves around the official explanation versus what internet commentators are calling missing context. Some reports describe a sequence of events involving hotel staff interactions and a delayed discovery timeline. Others question whether that sequence fully accounts for all movements and communication during the critical hours. But here's the important part: none of these claims are independently verified in the way viral content often implies. Yet, that hasn't stopped them from spreading as if they're established fact. And that's where the situation shifts from a private incident into a full-scale online phenomenon. Because once a story reaches this stage, it stops belonging to the people involved. It starts belonging to the internet. And the internet does not process events linearly. It reconstructs them emotionally. Now, another major reason this case exploded online is because of how quickly speculation began surrounding relationships, travel patterns, and financial background discussions tied to the individuals involved. Some creators started connecting unrelated past content, old posts, and business information, trying to build a larger narrative about motive, opportunity, and circumstance. Others pushed back, saying the internet was overreaching and filling in blanks with assumptions rather than facts. And that disagreement itself became part of the story. Because in viral investigations like this, the argument about the story becomes just as big as the story itself. Meanwhile, audiences watching all this unfold are split into three groups. The first group is trying to stay grounded, only accepting confirmed information and dismissing speculation. The second group is deeply invested in every update, analyzing every new clip or post like a developing case file. And the third group is simply consuming it as unfolding digital drama, not fully committing to any conclusion, just following the momentum. And all three groups are fueling the algorithm in different ways. That's why the content keeps circulating. That's why new videos keep appearing. And that's why the story refuses to fade. Because attention itself is the engine now, not resolution. As this continues, more breakdown-style videos begin emerging, each one presenting a slightly different interpretation of events. Some focus on emotional narratives. Some focus on timeline reconstruction. Some focus on inconsistencies. And others focus purely on reaction and shock value. But what they all have in common is uncertainty. No single version dominates. No single explanation settles the debate. Instead, everything exists in a constant state of contradiction. And that contradiction is exactly what keeps viewers engaged. Because the human brain is drawn to unfinished patterns, to missing pieces, to unresolved tension. Now, while online discussions intensify, one of the biggest turning points in viral cases like this is when official statements, reports, or clarifications enter the conversation. But even then, something interesting happens. Instead of closing the discussion, they often reopen it. Because people compare official versions with online interpretations, and instead of agreement, it creates more analysis, more debate, and more breakdown content. So the cycle continues. Information, speculation, reaction, reinterpretation, more speculation. And right now, this situation is still deep inside that cycle, which means it's not stabilizing yet. It's still evolving. And every new post, every new video, every new comment adds another layer to an already complicated narrative. But through all of this noise, one central question continues to dominate everything. Why does this story feel like it has more missing than what is being shown? And that question is exactly what pushes us into the next phase of the discussion, where interpretations collide even harder and the internet starts building its own version of what it believes happened next. And that question is exactly what pushes us into the next phase of the discussion, where interpretations collide even harder and the internet starts building its own version of what it believes happened next. Because once a story reaches this level of attention, something interesting happens to it. It stops being one timeline. It becomes multiple timelines running at the same time, each one supported by different clips, different breakdowns, different creators, and different interpretations of the same limited set of information. And at this point, viewers are no longer just watching events. They are choosing versions. Version 1 focuses on the official narrative as reported in early statements and summaries. Version 2 focuses on inconsistencies that internet commentators claim exist within the timeline. Version 3 is entirely speculative, built from reactions, assumptions, and reconstructed sequences. And none of them fully agree with each other. That disagreement is exactly what keeps the topic alive. Because clarity would end the discussion. But contradiction extends it. Now, one of the biggest patterns emerging in discussions around this case is how quickly small details become major talking points online. A single timestamp, a reported interaction, a gap in description. Each one gets isolated, analyzed, and expanded into full theories by different creators. And once that happens, the original context becomes less important than the interpretation built around it. This is how modern viral investigations evolve. Not through new evidence alone, but through reinterpretation of existing fragments. And in this phase, audience engagement becomes self-sustaining. People don't just consume content. They respond to content with more content. Breakdowns trigger reactions. Reactions trigger counter-breakdowns. Counter-breakdowns trigger debates. And debates restart the cycle again. It becomes an ecosystem of attention. Now, another major factor that keeps this situation circulating is emotional framing. Some narratives emphasize tragedy and unanswered questions. Others emphasize suspicion and contradiction. Others emphasize confusion and complexity without committing to any conclusion. Each framing attracts a different type of audience, and each audience reinforces the version they resonate with most. So instead of one dominant truth forming, What emerges is a network of competing interpretations. And that's where confusion grows. Because the more versions exist, the harder it becomes for audiences to separate confirmed information from speculation. And this is exactly why commentators often warn about consuming viral cases in fragments, because fragments can be rearranged into almost any narrative. Now, as discussion continues, another shift begins to appear online. People start revisiting earlier content connected to the individuals involved. Old posts, old interviews, old travel content. Not because they are new evidence, but because they provide emotional context that people use to reinforce their chosen interpretation. This is where hindsight bias becomes powerful. When people look back at old content after a viral incident, they often interpret neutral moments as meaningful clues. A normal expression becomes suspicious. A casual statement becomes significant. A travel clip becomes context. And slowly, the past gets rewritten through the lens of the present discussion. That's not unique to this case. It happens in almost every viral controversy. But here, because of the scale of attention, it's happening at a much faster rate. Now, within all this noise, there's still a group of viewers trying to hold onto a different approach. They focus only on what is confirmed. They ignore speculative breakdowns. They wait for official clarification or verified reporting before forming conclusions. But even that group is affected by the volume of content surrounding the story, because repeated exposure to speculation inevitably influences perception. That's how powerful repetition is online. Even uncertainty, when repeated enough, starts to feel familiar. And familiarity can sometimes be mistaken for truth. As the conversation continues to expand, platforms begin prioritizing engagement-heavy content around the topic. Short clips, reaction videos, commentary breakdowns. The algorithm doesn't distinguish between clarity and confusion. It only recognizes attention. So anything connected to the topic gets amplified. And that amplification reinforces the cycle even further. Now, at this stage, the original moment that started everything is no longer the center of discussion. It has become just one reference point among many. What dominates now is interpretation. And interpretation is constantly shifting, because every new video adds a slightly different angle. Every new post reframes the timeline slightly differently. And every new comment section builds its own version of understanding. And that's why this situation feels like it's still unfolding, even when no new confirmed information is being added. It's not the facts moving anymore. It's the narrative. And narratives don't need updates to evolve. They evolve through repetition and reinterpretation. Which leads us to the final layer of this entire discussion. At some point, every viral case reaches a saturation point, where everything that can be said has been said. But the conversation still continues. Not because of new information, but because audiences are still trying to make sense of conflicting interpretations. And when that happens, the story transitions into long-term internet memory. Something people reference. Something people debate. Something people revisit whenever similar discussions appear again online. And this is where this case is heading now. Not toward resolution, but toward lasting digital debate. Because in the end, what makes stories like this spread isn't just the content itself. It's the unanswered questions that refuse to disappear. And until those questions are fully resolved or officially clarified, the internet will keep doing what it always does. Rebuilding the story again and again, one fragment at a time. And until those questions are fully resolved or officially clarified, the internet will keep doing what it always does. Rebuilding the story again and again, one fragment at a time. Because at this stage, the situation is no longer about what was originally said or reported. It's about what people believe connects the dots. And when belief enters the equation, interpretation becomes stronger than information. That's exactly what's happening here. Different corners of the internet are now building completely separate frameworks of understanding. One framework treats the situation as a tragic incident surrounded by confusion and incomplete reporting. Another framework focuses heavily on inconsistencies that viewers claim exist between timelines and descriptions. And a third framework goes even further, treating every small detail as a potential clue inside a larger, unresolved narrative. None of these frameworks are officially confirmed, but all of them are circulating at the same time. And that's what makes this type of viral story so difficult to contain. Because once multiple interpretations exist, the conversation no longer belongs to one source. It belongs to the audience. And the audience does not move in one direction. It moves in clusters. Now, another major factor driving this entire discussion is how content creators are reshaping the narrative in real time. Short-form videos take single moments and isolate them for emotional impact. Long-form breakdowns attempt to reconstruct timelines step by step. Commentary channels focus on contradictions and unanswered questions. And reaction content adds emotional amplification to everything above. Each format contributes something different to the overall perception of the story. But none of them can present the full picture alone. Because the full picture, if it exists in complete form, is not publicly visible in one place. So what forms instead is a mosaic. A fragmented version of events assembled by thousands of interpretations. And mosaics always depend on perspective. Change the angle, and the image changes. Now, within this evolving narrative, one of the most discussed elements online is the timeline structure itself. Viewers are trying to map out sequences based on limited, publicly available information, but every attempt seems to introduce new gaps rather than close existing ones. That's because each reconstruction relies on assumptions where data is missing. And assumptions are where divergence begins. Once two people fill a gap differently, they no longer see the same story. And that's why discussions become polarized so quickly. Not because people are reacting to different facts, but because they are filling missing space in different ways. Meanwhile, social media platforms continue amplifying anything related to the topic. Even posts that are speculative or opinion-based get pushed into wider circulation simply because they generate engagement. And engagement does not require accuracy. It only requires reaction. So the cycle continues. A clip appears. People react. Commentary expands it. Debates form. New clips are created from the debate itself. And the cycle restarts. This recursive loop is what keeps viral situations alive far longer than traditional news cycles. Because instead of fading after initial reporting, the story evolves through audience participation. Now, as this participation grows, another shift begins to happen. The focus slowly moves away from the original incident and starts centering on interpretation itself. People are no longer just asking, what happened? They're asking, what do we think happened? And that question has no fixed answer. It depends entirely on perspective, trust, and interpretation of incomplete information. That's why even highly detailed breakdowns online often lead to more questions instead of resolution. Because every answer introduces new angles that require further explanation. At this point, the situation becomes self-sustaining. Even without new information, discussion continues. Because the topic has already embedded itself into online culture. And once something becomes part of online culture, it stops being dependent on updates. It becomes cyclical, revisited, reanalyzed, reinterpreted. Now, one of the most interesting parts of this entire cycle is how audiences begin to emotionally attach themselves to different versions of the story. Some viewers align themselves with the most logical interpretation. Others align with the most emotionally compelling version. And others simply follow whichever narrative is gaining traction at the moment. This emotional alignment influences how people consume new content about the situation. It also influences how they reject or accept new interpretations. And that's why discussions become increasingly divided over time. Because people aren't just debating facts. They're defending perspectives. And perspectives are harder to change than information. As the cycle continues, creators start adapting their content to match audience demand. Titles become more dramatic. Breakdowns become more speculative. Narratives become more structured around tension rather than clarity. And the algorithm rewards this shift because it increases watch time and engagement. So the system reinforces itself. More speculation leads to more engagement. More engagement leads to more content. More content leads to more interpretation. And more interpretation leads back to speculation. It's a loop with no natural endpoint unless something definitive breaks it. But until that happens, The story remains in motion, not progressing toward closure, but expanding through repetition. And that is the core of what makes this situation so widely discussed. Not just the original event, but the way it continues to evolve through collective interpretation. Now, as we move toward the final stage of this breakdown, one key realization becomes clear. In viral narratives like this, truth and perception rarely move at the same speed. Truth is slow, structured, and dependent on verification. Perception is fast, emotional, and shaped by fragments. And when perception moves faster than truth, the internet fills the gap in its own way. And once that happens, the original story becomes less important than the version the internet agrees to believe. Which brings everything back to one final lingering question. In a world where narratives evolve faster than facts can be confirmed, what matters more, what actually happened? Or what people collectively believe happened? And that question is where this entire conversation continues to live, even after the noise eventually moves on. Now I want to hear from you, because this is exactly the kind of situation where every viewer walks away with a different opinion. After everything we just broke down, you've seen how quickly a story like this can evolve online, how fragments turn into narratives, how interpretations take over facts, and how the internet builds multiple versions of the same situation at the same time. But the real question is, which version makes the most sense to you? Do you think this is just another example of how fast misinformation and speculation can spread across social media, turning unclear details into a full-blown viral discussion? Or do you feel like situations like this always have deeper layers that only come out once time passes and more clarity arrives? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your opinion actually adds to the conversation. Every comment helps shape how people see this situation from different angles, and that's what makes these discussions interesting. No two viewers see it exactly the same way. And if you enjoy this kind of breakdown content, where we don't just repeat what's trending, but actually analyze how and why it spreads across platforms, then make sure you're subscribed to the channel. Because this is exactly what we do here. We follow viral stories, break down the narratives behind them, and help you see beyond the surface-level noise. Also, don't forget to hit the like button if you want more deep dive content like this, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next breakdown when it drops. Because in this space, the next viral story can appear at any moment, and you'll want to be here when it does.